2 weeks ago, I recited a verse of the Holy Quran which says to Muslims, obey Allah, obey the Holy Prophet, and obey those in authority from among you. And I gave that khutbah the title, Morality, Legality, and Practicality. And I made the point that morality as defined by humans changes. It's different in different parts of the world. Not long ago, there used to be parts of Africa where there were tribes, and if a guest arrived, the most delicious, sumptuous meal you could offer him would be to find a Christian missionary and kill him and roast him and offer him to your guest. Oh, they thought that was perfectly fine. And but other people thought, well, perhaps this is not such a good idea. This is not the sort of morality we want to propagate and preach. But the point is that different societies, different cultures have different definitions of morality. So when God says, when the Holy Quran says, obey Allah, what it's telling us is that there is an absolute morality. And I raised this again because the examples I gave and the example last time, 2 weeks ago, and the example I've given today are, of course, historical. And people say, well, this doesn't happen anymore. But recently, in the last week, we've had two things which bring this topic to light. Three things, really. I attended a meeting just across the road from the Houses of Parliament, where there were a number of MPs present, some Church of England, some Roman Catholic, and etc. And one of them expressed one extreme view, not an MP, one of the members of the audience, and that was that unless we bring God into politics, we will continue to have the sort of this disconnect between morality and legality. And which on the face of it sounds like a good idea, but I pointed out that perhaps in a multi-religious society, this wouldn't be practical. For this reason, that I pointed out that if a government enacts legislation which says that the short-term high-interest loans called payday loans and so on, which are given at rates of 3,000% are outlawed, or they can only charge interest which is equivalent to the interest on a credit card, which will be about 30%. There is one section of the audience that will say, that's great, that's brilliant. But I pointed to a Muslim there who was a member of the panel, and I said to him, but you will still say, this is war against the God. This is war against God. Because the verse of the Holy Quran says that those who indulge in usury are actually carrying out a war against Allah. So I said, if you bring God into politics, that is the difficulty that you will have. And I pointed out to this gentleman, although I was going to make this a topic for a different khutbah, that when we had the collapse of the banking systems in the West, like Lehman Brothers and Bank of Scotland and others, what I expected from people like him, he used to be a derivatives trader for a bank. What I expected from people like him was an economic theory and economic modeling to show that an Islamic system of commerce and economics can replace the capitalist system of commerce and economics. And again, we saw that this intellectual failure at the recent international conference where the Prime Minister tried to encourage Islamic finance and banking in the United Kingdom and tried to make it the hub, certainly for Europe, if not internationally. That what people were saying were, well, what is Islamic banking? And what they were saying were, well, here is this mobile phone. You come to me to buy it. You don't have the money to buy this mobile phone, which is £10. And I'll say to you, well, take the phone away. You keep it, you use it, but pay me 2 years later, but give me £15. How is that not charging an interest? I mean, apart from the only difference, it appears to me, is that if you go to a mobile phone shop, they will arrange a credit agreement with someone else. The only difference is you're not arranging a credit agreement with someone else. The credit agreement is between you, the shop, and the customer. What is needed is not sort of this kind of sophistry and playing with words and so on, to say, oh, you know, like in a country, they said we have abolished interest, which was great. And I went round and I looked into the bank windows and so on, and indeed they had abolished interest. The word interest was nowhere to be found. You could not say deposit money with us and we'll pay you 3% interest. What it said was, if you deposit money with us, the profit you will get will be 3%. Is that what the Quran means? That you whitewash the word interest and write on it profit, and that is getting rid of interest. No, a more fundamental approach to banking and finance and commerce is required, because the whole issue depends on the morality of giving high interest loans. If you look at that verse of the Holy Quran, what it says is that people who cannot afford necessities of life, you should not be giving them, you should not be lending them money at a high rate of interest. You should be giving them charity to help them with their daily needs. But at the same point, it also says, okay, if you can't afford to give away your money, then give it to them without charging any interest at all. And that is the system that we need to develop. We need to have, these are the days of computers and so on. We need to have an economic model to show how this system will work and what impact it will have on economics and commerce and banking throughout the world, and how it will benefit people. These things are not beyond human imagination. Many years ago, when I worked for what used to be called Department of Health and Social Security, which is now Department of Works and Pensions, every year when the Chancellor prepared his proposals for the budget, an increase in income tax, an increase in benefits and housing benefit and council tax benefit and job seekers allowance and whatever else you have, what was the first thing he would do? He would send those proposals to us, and he will say, okay, can you please tell me what impact my proposals will have on the poor people in the country, in the society? And I had developed what we call the model. Basically, it was a huge computer program where you could input variables like these things, which I would input and then see whether the number of poor is going to increase or decrease. And there's one thing, something called poverty trap, and whether people will get out of poverty trap, and etc. This was years, and perhaps 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So why is it that Muslims, with all their financial resources and so on, cannot build an economic model of how a particular country or society will be impacted if it got rid of charging interest and started lending money in whatever way it is that they are proposing? But keeping in mind the morality of this thing. But then this brings us to another point, which goes back to my first meeting. It wasn't just my meeting, there were loads of other people as well, where MPs were present, and that is that it's not bringing God into politics, it's bringing morality into politics and banking and commerce. That is required. Even if you bring God into politics and you don't bring morality into it, there'll be no difference at all. Last time I gave you an example that there are countries where they say, God is the center of politics. He revealed the Quran and we'll decide everything by the Holy Quran. And then we make laws to say anyone who wants to be a member of parliament has to be honest, truthful, dependable, trustworthy. There's a whole load of conditions. But then when it comes to elections and so on, is it actually possible to find those people in that society? And that is because although you have made God the center, in theory, the center of your constitution, you haven't made morality that God revealed in the Holy Quran the center of that society or that assembly or parliament or senate or whatever it is. And we had two examples recently. Many of you will remember that there was a small child given the name Baby P. P stood for Peter. It is usual in law that where identity is to be hidden, the first letter of the first name is used to denote someone. That was a small child that was brutally raped and killed by the mother's boyfriend and boyfriend's brother. And the mother allowed it to happen. The child went to the hospital, and the hospital missed the signs of abuse. Many times the child was taken away, at least 2 or 3 times the child was taken away by the parents, but then taken away from the mother and put with family friends and then returned to the mother. And when the child's death, which came about because this 2-year-old child was punched in the face by the mother's boyfriend, and that child had just come back from hospital where doctors had failed to pick up the fact that the child had broken ribs and the child actually had a broken back. When that child came home and it cried, it was punched in the face by the mother's boyfriend and punched so hard that his teeth were broken. and one of the teeth lodged in his windpipe, and he suffocated to death. There was understandable uproar in the whole country. And these people were arrested and they were tried. And you would have thought that people who've subjected an innocent little child, who can't tell anyone what he or she is going through, you would wonder what sort of punishment they're going to get. Mother was sent to prison, her boyfriend was sent to prison, her boyfriend's brother was sent to prison, and everyone clapped. But does anyone know that last week that child's mother was released from prison? She went to prison in 2009, and in 2013, 4 years later, she's been let out. And you would think, where is the morality in that sentencing? You see, what happens is, people sometimes blame judges and so on. What happens is that Parliament makes the law. They said, my khutbahs is the legality. And the practicality is, then the Parliament gives judges sentencing guidelines. If someone says this is the maximum punishment that you will hand down for this crime, for this person. So a judge cannot just give a judgment which says, I send you to prison for 100 years or I fine you £1 million. It's the same in civil law. If you have an accident and you lose an arm, you pick up a book of law and it will tell you loss of one arm, this is how much you're going to get from the court by way of compensation. But it makes you think, how moral is that sentencing guideline which the Parliament gave that says that a sentence of 4 years is enough for a mother who allows her child, who's under 2 years old, to be subjected to such brutality and such torture and eventually to be killed, that she is let out after 4 years. Then presumably I wouldn't be surprised if her boyfriend's brother follows suit and he's allowed to leave in the next few months. And the man who actually did the killing will probably be free next year or the year after. So there is this disconnect between morality, legality, and practicality. Again, there was complete uproar, and this lady who was the head of children's department in social services in Haringey, I think it was, Sharon Pewsmith, she was immediately sacked by the employment secretary, I think it was Ed Bowles at the time. And she went to the employment tribunal for compensation for unfair dismissal and wrongful dismissal. Now, and the employment tribunal has awarded her, it is said, £600,000 for loss of job and reputation and the way she was treated. Now, in law, that decision is perfectly correct. That's what the law says. That because of the way in which the minister behaved, and without waiting for an inquiry, went on television and trashed this person and her reputation and so on, she needs to be compensated. That's what the law says. In law, that decision is perfectly correct. But is it a moral decision? See, some people say that, she was the head of social services. How is she supposed to know what is going on, and it's not really her fault, etc., etc. Well, what is her job? She's not a social worker who's going to go out and visit families. What is she supposed to do? Her job is actually to make sure that her staff act in accordance with the law and make sure the children are protected. But that is a separate debate and a separate issue. Now, I want you to compare these two things. I want you to keep in mind the morality, what should happen to people involved in the brutal killing of this innocent baby. And I want you to keep in mind decisions which are perfectly legal and lawful. Release of baby P's mother from prison is in accordance with guidelines to the committees which hear these applications for early release. Is it a moral decision? That is the thing. It's a lawful decision, but is it a moral decision? In the same way, giving this lady, whatever her name was, Shoesmith, £600,000 for loss of her job. It's a perfectly legal decision, and in law it is perfectly right. There is no doubt. Is it a moral decision? And that's where the difficulty lies. That we have disconnected morality from our daily lives. We have disconnected morality from legality. We no longer say whether, morally speaking, this legislation is justified. I could give a list of 1,000 laws which I regard them as immoral. I'll give one example. If you are a foreigner, let's say a foreign student trying to come into the UK, and you make an application and it's refused for reasons which are completely wrong. Someone is coming to the UK to study, nuclear technology, and you refuse him saying, well, I don't think when you go to UK, you're going to study economics. Obviously, the officer who decides this hasn't even looked at the application, or he's confused it with some other application, or there are two people with similar names and he's confusing them. But the decision is totally wrong and nonsensical. Question is, what can you do about it? Morality will say there should be somewhere that you can go and shout and say, this is totally wrong. But legislation says, no, you can't. You can't appeal. This decision has been made. That's it. It's final. It's perfectly legal. And unless we have a connect between morality and legislation, which is another way of saying that is what Hazrat Masih Maud said, that unless we actually implement Islam into our lives, or the one sentence that he said, which is part of the pledge, that I shall hold my religion above my worldly considerations, then we will continue to find this sort of conflict between the two things. And of course, earlier on, some years ago, we had the MP's expenses printed on television, in newspapers and shown on television and so on. And we saw how some of them were even claiming 30p for buying a chocolate when they were away on business, and others were claiming for repairs to their lakes in their country states, etc., etc. The question then arises, if those who are going to legislate, these are their morals, how are they going to create any legislation which has any connect between morality and legality. These are issues that all of us need to think about, particularly Muslims, because there were two economic systems in the world, two social systems. One was communism, which was community-based, not family-based, community-based. The other one is capitalism, which is individual-based. I don't care about him. As long as I can make a buck, I'm fine. Whether it means that he then suffers has nothing to do with me. One system has totally collapsed. The other, the economic part of the other system, collapsed. It was propped up by the governments. Its social consequences show us that it is in the process of collapsing. But if Islam has a solution to these problems, then there is no point in just standing at pulpits and saying Islam has a solution to these problems. What Muslims have to show is what that solution is. And that's why I said there's no point saying ban interest, ban this, ban that. It's only when you come up with another economic model that you can test on computer systems and where you can show its results and they're discussed and debated in public, that we will make any progress.